What if the single most powerful food for protecting your brain isn't something you'll find in your kitchen, your pharmacy, or even your country? Not a pill, not a supplement, not something engineered in a lab, but something that grows quietly beneath the surface of the ocean. And here's the unsettling truth: entire populations who consume it daily are aging with sharper minds, stronger memory, and dramatically lower rates of cognitive decline, while the rest of the world is watching dementia rates explode. That's not a coincidence. That's a clue. Because right now, something is happening globally that most people don't fully understand, and it's accelerating faster than we're prepared for. Across the world, millions of people are slowly losing their memories, their identities, and ultimately, their independence. We're talking about a condition that doesn't just affect individuals, it reshapes entire families. Dementia. And at the center of it, Alzheimer's disease. Today, over 55 million people are living with dementia worldwide, and that number isn't slowing down. It's projected to nearly triple in the coming decades. Think about that for a second. This isn't a rare condition anymore. This is becoming the norm. Walk into any room filled with older adults, and statistically, at least one person is already living with it. But here's the part most people don't realize. We still don't have a cure. We have medications, yes, but they don't stop the disease. They don't reverse it. At best, they slow things down slightly, which means one thing becomes more important than anything else: prevention. And that's where this conversation changes everything. Because not all countries are experiencing this crisis the same way. In fact, some populations, despite having older average ages, are showing remarkably low rates of Alzheimer's and dementia. And when scientists started investigating why, they found something fascinating. It wasn't genetics. It wasn't healthcare access. It wasn't even exercise. It kept coming back to one consistent factor: diet. More specifically, a category of food that most people in the Western world barely consume at all. A food that shows up again and again in cultures with exceptional brain health. A food that has been quietly consumed for centuries, long before modern medicine ever tried to understand the brain. And yet, for most people watching this right now, it's either unfamiliar, overlooked, or completely absent from their diet. Now here's where it gets interesting. When researchers compared different populations across the world, the contrast was staggering. In some regions, dementia rates were shockingly low, so low, in fact, that scientists initially thought there had to be an error in the data. But there wasn't. Same human brain, same biology, completely different outcomes. Why? Because what you feed your brain determines how it ages. And hidden inside this overlooked food group is something even more powerful: a unique biological profile that doesn't exist in typical land-based foods. We're talking about compounds your brain doesn't just benefit from. It recognizes, depends on. This isn't about trends or hype. This is about biology. This is about understanding that your brain is not just influenced by what you eat. It is built from it. And once you see what's actually happening at the cellular level, you'll never look at food the same way again. Because in the next part, we're going to break down exactly what this ocean-grown food really is, why it's fundamentally different from anything else you've ever eaten, and how its unique structure gives it the ability to interact with your brain in ways most foods simply cannot. Stay with me, because what you're about to discover isn't just information. It's a completely different way of thinking about your brain, your future, and the silent choices shaping both right now. Because what you're about to discover isn't just information, it's a completely different way of thinking about your brain, your future, and the silent choices shaping both right now. Let's go deeper. The food we're talking about isn't a vegetable. It's not a grain. It's not even something that grows on land. It belongs to an entirely different biological category: marine algae, commonly known as seaweed. Now, most people hear seaweed and immediately think of sushi rolls or something exotic and unfamiliar, but that surface-level understanding completely misses what makes it so powerful. Because from a biological standpoint, marine algae is unlike anything else in your diet. Here's why that matters. Every plant that grows on land pulls nutrients from soil. That soil is limited, it's been depleted over time, it depends on seasons, weather, and environmental conditions. But marine algae? It absorbs its nutrients directly from the ocean. And the ocean is one of the most mineral-rich environments on the planet. which means seaweed becomes a concentrated reservoir of compounds that are either rare or completely absent in land-based foods. We're talking about dense levels of iodine critical for brain signaling and metabolic regulation. We're talking about specialized compounds like fucoidins, complex molecules that don't exist in typical diets, but are now being heavily studied for their neurological effects. And most importantly, we're talking about omega, 3 fatty acids in a form your brain can immediately recognize and use. Not convert, not process inefficiently. Use because your brain is nearly 60% fat, and a large portion of that structure is built from one specific type of fat, DHA. So when you consume marine algae, you're not just eating nutrients. You're supplying raw material, structural components, fuel for the very organ you're trying to protect. Now let's break this down even further. There isn't just one type of seaweed. There are multiple categories, each with its own biological profile. Green algae, brown algae, and red algae. The ones that have drawn the most attention in brain research are the brown and red varieties. These are the types commonly consumed in traditional coastal diets. And they show up in different forms. Thin, dark sheets often used in wraps. Soft, silky strands floating in soups. Thicker, denser strips used to create mineral-rich broths. Each one may look simple, even unimpressive. But internally, they are biochemically dense. Now here's where things start to shift from interesting to extraordinary. Because the real power of marine algae isn't just in what it contains, it's in what it does. At a cellular level, inside your brain, this is the part most people never hear about. Because when we talk about brain health, we usually hear vague advice: eat better, exercise more, reduce stress, all useful but incomplete. What's missing is mechanism. What is actually happening inside the brain when it begins to decline? And more importantly, what can interrupt that process? Because Alzheimer's disease doesn't appear overnight, it builds slowly, silently, for years, sometimes decades before symptoms ever show up. Proteins begin to misfold. Toxic clusters start forming between neurons. Inflammation quietly increases. Communication between brain cells starts to break down. And by the time memory loss becomes noticeable, that process is already deeply established. But here's the breakthrough insight. Certain compounds found in marine algae don't just support general health. They directly interact with these processes. They intervene. They disrupt. They slow down, and in some cases, potentially prevent the very mechanisms driving cognitive decline. Not in one way, but through multiple pathways at the same time, which is something no single drug has been able to replicate effectively. And that's exactly what we're going to uncover next. Because in the following part, I'm going to walk you step by step through the 5 specific biological mechanisms through which this ocean-grown food protects your brain. We're going beyond surface-level benefits. We're going into the actual science of how your brain is being affected cell by cell. And once you understand these 5 pathways, you'll realize why this isn't just another healthy food conversation. This is about targeting the root of brain aging itself. So stay with me, because what comes next might completely change how you think about preventing memory loss before it ever begins. So stay with me, because what comes next might completely change how you think about preventing memory loss before it ever begins. Now we move into the part that truly matters, the mechanisms. Not opinions, not trends, not generalized advice. Actual biological processes happening inside your brain right now. Because if you understand how something works, you understand why it matters. And marine algae doesn't just support brain health in a vague way, it targets the very pathways that drive cognitive decline. There are 5 key mechanisms through which it protects your brain. Let's break them down one by one. Mechanism 1. It helps clear toxic protein buildup. One of the defining features of Alzheimer's disease is the accumulation of toxic proteins in the brain. These proteins, often referred to as plaques and tangles, begin to cluster between and inside brain cells. At first, it's subtle, but over time, these clusters disrupt communication between neurons and eventually lead to cell death. Now here's where things get interesting. Compounds found in marine algae, particularly in certain brown varieties, have been shown in research to interfere with this process. They don't just sit passively in your system. They actively reduce the formation of these toxic clusters. Even more fascinating, They appear to stimulate the brain's own cleanup system. Your brain has specialized immune cells that act like a maintenance crew, identifying waste and clearing it away. But as we age, these cells become less efficient. The system slows down. Debris accumulates. Marine algae compounds help reactivate this system, essentially telling your brain, clean this up. Mechanism 2, it reduces brain inflammation. Now, let's talk about something that quietly drives almost every chronic disease. Inflammation. But we're not talking about visible swelling or injury. We're talking about neuroinflammation, inflammation inside the brain. This type of inflammation damages neurons, weakens connections between them, and accelerates aging at the cellular level. It also interferes with your ability to form and retain memories. And here's the problem. Most people are unknowingly fueling this process every single day. Through diet, through stress, through lifestyle. Now here's where marine algae becomes powerful again. It contains compounds that can cross into the brain and directly reduce inflammatory signals. At the same time, it provides omega-3 fatty acids that help calm these pathways even further. Think about that. You're not just reducing inflammation in the body, you're reducing it at the source of cognition itself. Mechanism 3, it supports the thyroid-brain connection. This is one of the most overlooked pieces of the puzzle. Your brain doesn't operate in isolation. It depends heavily on your thyroid. The thyroid produces hormones that regulate how your brain uses energy. When thyroid function drops, even slightly, brain performance declines. Memory becomes less reliable. Focus weakens. Mental clarity fades. And one of the most common reasons for reduced thyroid function? Iodine deficiency. Now remember what we talked about earlier. Marine algae is one of the richest natural sources of iodine on the planet, which means it supports a system that directly influences how your brain functions every single day. But here's the key. It's not about excess. It's about balance. And for many people, especially those not consuming ocean-based foods regularly, this balance is off without them even realizing it. Mechanism 4. It strengthens the gut-brain axis. Now this one changes how most people think about brain health entirely. Because your brain isn't just in your head. It's connected to your gut, constantly. Through nerves, hormones, and immune signals, this connection is known as the gut-brain axis. And the health of your gut microbiome, your internal ecosystem of bacteria, directly influences how your brain performs. Mood, memory, inflammation, all of it is connected. Marine algae contains unique fibers that act as fuel for beneficial gut bacteria. These bacteria then produce compounds that reduce inflammation throughout the body, including in the brain. So what you're eating in your gut is literally shaping what's happening in your mind. Mechanism 5. It protects against oxidative stress. Finally, we come to one of the most fundamental drivers of aging, oxidative stress. Every day, your brain produces energy. And as a byproduct, it generates unstable molecules, often called free radicals. In small amounts, this is normal. But when they build up, they start damaging cells. DNA, cell membranes, mitochondria. Over time, this damage accumulates and accelerates brain aging. Now here's the reality. Your brain uses a massive amount of energy compared to the rest of your body, which means it's constantly exposed to this kind of stress. Marine algae provides a unique combination of antioxidants that help neutralize these harmful molecules. Not just generally, but specifically in brain tissue. Now step back for a moment and look at the bigger picture. Most interventions target one pathway, one symptom, one piece of the puzzle. Marine algae? It works across 5 different mechanisms simultaneously. Protein buildup, inflammation, hormonal balance, gut health. Oxidative damage, that's not common, that's powerful. And it explains why populations consuming it regularly are experiencing something the rest of the world is struggling to maintain: long-term cognitive resilience. But here's the real question. Does this actually translate into real-world results? Not just lab studies, not just theory, but actual human outcomes? That's exactly where we're going next. Stay with me, because what you're about to see now is where everything shifts from theory to undeniable reality. We've talked about mechanisms. We've broken down biology. We've explored what's happening inside the brain. But none of that matters unless it shows up in real human lives. And this is exactly where the evidence becomes impossible to ignore. Because when researchers began studying long-term dietary patterns in populations with exceptional brain health, they found something remarkably consistent. People who regularly consumed marine algae as part of their daily diet didn't just feel better. They showed measurably lower rates of cognitive decline. Not slightly lower, significantly lower. In long-term observational studies, tracking older adults over many years, individuals who followed traditional dietary patterns rich in ocean-based foods, plant diversity, fermented products showed dramatically reduced risk of developing dementia. We're talking about reductions that weren't just statistically relevant, but clinically meaningful. People weren't just scoring a little better on tests. They were maintaining independence longer, retaining memory longer, living with clarity longer. Now here's where it gets even more compelling. Researchers didn't just stop at observing these patterns, they analyzed them. They identified specific dietary combinations that consistently showed protective effects. And marine algae kept appearing as a central component, again and again, alongside vegetables, fermented foods, tea, and healthy fats. But here's the key insight most people miss. It wasn't just one food doing everything, it was the synergy, the combination, the way these foods work together to support multiple systems in the body simultaneously. And marine algae acted like a foundational piece in that system. Now let's address the question that naturally comes up. Is this just genetics? Are some populations simply wired differently? Because if that were true, none of this would apply. But the evidence says otherwise. When individuals from these same populations moved to different countries and changed their diets, something striking happened. Their risk levels changed too. They began to mirror the rates of the populations around them. Higher processed food intake, lower nutrient density, less traditional dietary structure, and with that shift, the protective effect disappeared. Same genetics, different outcomes, which tells us something incredibly important. Your future brain health is not pre-written. It is being shaped daily by what you consistently do, and especially by what you consistently eat. Now let's bring this back to you. Because at this point, the question isn't whether this works. The question is, what do you actually do with this information? Because knowledge without action doesn't change outcomes. And the good news is, you don't need to overhaul your entire life overnight. You don't need extreme diets. You don't need complicated routines. What matters most is simple, consistent integration. Starting small, but starting correctly. Imagine beginning your day with something that actually supports your brain instead of slowly working against it. Instead of reaching for habits that spike inflammation or drain energy, you shift toward habits that stabilize, nourish, and protect. It doesn't have to be complicated. It just has to be intentional. Because over time, small daily inputs compound. And those compounds shape your biology, your clarity, your memory, your future. Now here's something most people don't think about until it's too late. Cognitive decline doesn't start when symptoms appear. It starts years earlier, silently, gradually, without obvious warning signs. Which means the actions you take today are either slowing that process down or accelerating it. There is no neutral. And that's why this matters. Not next year, not someday. Now, because the brain you will have 10, 20, 30 years from now is being built today, meal by meal, choice by choice, habit by habit. So before you move on from this, ask yourself something honestly. Are your current habits building a brain that stays sharp, or one that slowly fades without you noticing? Because once you become aware of this, you can't unsee it. And more importantly, you can finally do something about it. If this opened your perspective even slightly, then don't keep it to yourself. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. Because most people are walking toward cognitive decline without even realizing it. And one piece of information at the right time can completely change that path. Make sure you subscribe and stay connected, because what we're uncovering here goes far beyond surface-level health advice. This is about understanding how your body actually works and using that knowledge to your advantage. And if you're serious about protecting your brain long-term, then the next thing you need to understand is how your overall diet pattern either amplifies or cancels out everything we talked about today. Because one food alone isn't the full answer, but the right system, that changes everything. I'll see you in the next part.